Or was it June of 2013? A woman got up and she put on her business attire. But that morning she put on something different, a pair of pink shoes. And she made her way to the floor of the Senate in Austin at the Capitol. And that woman proceeded to talk for 13 hours. I don't know what got into her. Do you? Does anybody remember her name? Wendy Davis. Yes. Why did do you think Wendy Davis just had a whole lot to say that day, or was there a reason for her filibuster? You see, that's when Governor Perry called a special session for the sole reason to enact all these cruel, theocratic, war on women bills in the state of Texas. And Wendy Davis had the moral courage to stand up and to put herself on the line for 13 hours of speaking in an effort to try to stop that bill. And she empowered the people. There was then what followed, what was called the People's Filibuster, when this went to the House. Anybody remember that? When the clock struck midnight, they could not do business anymore. I'm proud to say that several of our Unitarian Universalists were in that gallery. I couldn't get back in the gallery that day because it was packed. I was watching online. But they were able to make enough noise in a people's filibuster that it ran out the clock for that special session. They were unable to pass these cruel bills. Unfortunately, Governor Perry called a special session number 2, and the cruel bills, the war on women bills, were passed. Most of them have been ruled unconstitutional, but several of them still remain and visit cruelty and meanness, particularly upon women of color, those who do not have the means to travel for reproductive justice, or for reproductive health services. Now, why is this so important to us as Unitarian Universalists? Is it just like, oh, this is like the latest liberal thing that we've been notified, through the media and all this kind of stuff, and that we're supposed to be a part of? Is that why we're involved in this kind of work? I want to tell you a story because it's in our spiritual DNA. Let me tell you about a woman named Judith Sargent Murray. This is back in the 1790s in America. Her father was a very successful sea merchant. Now, all the while, her brother had a personal tutor to prepare him to go to Harvard University. Judith was only afforded the most rudimentary reading and writing skills. But because her family was well off, they had a very nice family library. And Judith applied herself to educate herself from that family library. And she began to write. She began to have a consciousness about women's place in the world, women's place in America. She began to write under a pseudonym, Constantina. Why do you think that she might have to write with a pseudonym? You think it might have been a little bit dangerous to come out and talk about women and men and that connection? Well, she ended up marrying a man that I mentioned earlier named Reverend John Murray. And she was very vital in them working together, basically as universalist missionaries in America, to turn people away from this cruel God who was going to punish everyone eternally if you didn't follow the rules, and saying that the love of God was much, much more powerful and beautiful than the judgment of God. And to his credit, I don't think this was the norm during this day. He was very supportive of her writing. Now, she wrote what is considered to be one of the first women's equality pieces that was ever published in the world. She wrote this in 1779. But yet, it wasn't published in the Massachusetts magazine until 1790. Why do you think it laid on her desk fallow for 11 years? It was because of the climate. It was because a war on women mentality. It's because of mentality that men are supreme, that men rule, that you are property. But yet she finally, with the encouragement of her husband, wrote this piece. It was published in 1790 in the Massachusetts magazine. And I'm going to just give you a brief excerpt from that. And she wrote, "Yes, ye haughty sex." That's us men. In case you're not getting it. "Yes, you haughty sex. God breathed into us the same breath of life that God breathed into you, and that we are by nature equal with you because God breathed into us the same breath that enlivens, that invigorates our very souls." Now I'm going to take you back to the modern day in Texas, because when we were there during that special session, the ministers and the disciples and followers of a small sect of one religion that's very well known in Texas and in America, who really are intent on forcing their religious beliefs onto everyone through the laws, a small, cruel, hostile, but well-organized sect of religion. They were having their rallies. They were having their ministers. They were shouting and getting all excited about their viewpoint that these laws should be passed. Now, there was a woman, a UU woman from the First Jefferson congregation in Fort Worth, and she saw that this was going to be a historic time. She had her 2 young boys, I don't know, 8 or 10 years old. She called me up. She said, "Chuck, I'm coming down to Austin. I want my boys to see this. I want them to see what our religion stands for. I want them to see that at the critical and crucial times we're there, we're present, we're working, and we're there to talk about our faith and how our faith is different than what's being articulated." And so I met them. We went around, and so she noticed all these rallies going on, these religious rallies. And she came up to me and she said, "Chuck, when and where is our religious gathering of this sort?" And have you ever had one of those questions when you had to look down at your shoes? I had to look down at my shoes and I said, "We don't have one." You see, it wasn't that there weren't ministers of faith, religious leaders of faith, congregants of faith, and people of goodwill who were not of faith per se, but certainly were in favor of the moral agency of women. It wasn't that we weren't up there, but as they say in West Texas, we were like BBs in the barrel. We were just kind of bouncing around there. I'd say, oh, here's one over there, and oh, I know them, and I know that person, and I know that church. We were not organized. We were not mobilized. So you had a bunch of individuals and pockets of individuals who were up there doing the work, whereas this group was very well organized, very well mobilized. And by the way, the Universalist missionary, Reverend James Billing, who came to Texas in the late 1800s, said this, and it was well illustrated during that time, that organized error, E-R-R-O-R, hey, I could be in the finals of the spelling bee with that, couldn't I? Organized error will outdistance unorganized truth every time. And so that's when some of us said, by God, this is going to be the last time this happens. And so that's why we organized something called Texas Faith Voices for Reproductive Justice. And that's why we said to ourselves, what could we do that would be a public declaration of faith communities to let people know in the state of Texas that there are churches, there are congregations who have a very different viewpoint. You know, a couple of years before this, when we first started going up there as progressive people of faith, I remember vividly going to Kirk Watson's office. Kirk Watson was former mayor of Austin. Now Senator Watson, very much an ally. And when we went and started talking about this, his aide said, "Where have you been? Where have you been?" It always gets thrown up to us, oh, the religious voice agrees with us. The religious voice thinks we should make these kinds of laws. And when I went to another office, after I told him I was a minister and told him where I stood, the young man, he wiped the sweat off his brow and he said, "I just knew when you said you were a minister, you were going to say the exact opposite of what you just said to me." You see, that's how far we have allowed the narrative to be seized and to be degraded and devolved, and the groundwater be poisoned by this small sect of well-organized theocrats. You want to live in a theocracy? We're well on our way to it, particularly in regards to women's reproductive justice. So I want to thank you for the courage to say, literally come out of the closet and say, First UU Houston is a reproductive justice congregation. We honor the moral agency and the conscience of women. We honor that sacred trinity of a woman, her creator, and her doctor to make these decisions. And yes, even if they have to make the tough decision to have an abortion, we support, we don't judge. We trust women more than we trust Father Knows Best and theocratic legislators in Austin or in Washington, D.C. So it's vitally important that this community know this is a safe and sacred place for a woman to be. So thank you for standing up. And if you don't think it's a big deal, one of the originators of this program, when he went to his progressive congregation, their board said, "Oh, this is way too radical for us." Well, it's way too political for us. You see, that's how the religious and the moral narrative have been so dominated that even progressive communities of faith who have stood up about every other thing in the world were scared to do it about this. I'm happy to tell you that we're taking the lead. Of the 16 congregations who have the courage to do this, I'm happy to tell you, of the 17, I didn't count you guys, 13 of them are Unitarian Universalist congregations. So we're taking the leadership, and we are going to continue to work that we get other denominations involved in this. Thank you. Now, why is this important? I want to take you back again because this is important because it's part of our spiritual DNA. I want to tell you about a woman named Frances Harper. She lived in the 1800s. Her parents were freed slaves. But when she was 3 years old, her mother died. Her uncle gave her rudimentary reading and writing skills. Now, as she got older, when she was 14, she was hired by a white family to do domestic work. Do you remember what the laws were about allowing or helping a black person to learn to read and write? Do you remember what that was during those days? It was illegal. It was illegal. But yet, you're going to see a pattern here. They had a good family library, and Frances Harper, they said, hey, we're not going to look when you go in there. She educated herself from the family library. She became one of the most well-known poets in America at the time, black or white. She was one of the, I guess you could say she was the early Oprah. You know, she would like go all over on poetry and literature circuits. She refused to charge any black person for her services to speak. She was a member of the Unitarian Church in Philadelphia. And she was invited when the World's Fair came to Chicago in 1893. They had a women's congress as part of that World's Fair. And the Unitarian African-American woman, Frances Harper, was asked to be one of the speakers. I'm going to give you an excerpt of what she wrote, or what she spoke. She said, we're in a time now where there is this emancipation of thought. There is this expansion of freedom. But let that be for both sexes. Let it not just be for the men, because you cannot raise one sex with emancipation of thought and freedom and leave behind the women. The women must be equal sharers of this gift of freedom. Now I'm going to take you back to the present one more time here. By the way, is there a story yet?
1-0.
Oh no!
Uh-oh. I'm just afraid the people who are recording get angry. Alright, sorry about that. Can you edit that out of the video later? Okay, so what's going on in America today? We have an all-out assault and war on women as bad as it's been in a long, long time. I cannot tell you how many women I've talked to said, I thought these issues were settled back in 1973 at the Roe v. Wade decision. But now we have a temporary, and I want to emphasize the word temporary, hostile occupier of the White House who assaults women, who brags about assaulting women, about once a month another woman comes forward and talks about it, who seems to be inoculated from this because when they're going back, this person knows I can key in to the horrible original sins of America, all of them. Sexism, racism, xenophobia, you name it. Cruelty to those who don't look like us. Furthermore, appoints cabinet officers who routinely are accused of these kinds of things. Oh, well, city didn't do it. Fine with me. I believe it. We all watched the confirmation of Mr. Kavanaugh. We know what that was about. We go when Dr. Blasey Ford gave her testimony, and even the people who are the architects of this war on women said, oh, yeah, well, and they didn't even have the guts to say, yeah, she's a blanket liar. Oh, we believe her, it just must have been somebody else. She has a false memory of who it was. That means you don't believe it. Now, are you aware that in the Texas House, this time there was a bill heard that said that abortion is murder, that a doctor or a woman who participates can get the death penalty? Are you aware of that?
Yeah, sort of.
You don't think the war on women has been wrapped up in this ridiculous law in Alabama and all these 8 or 10 other states in a race to get the most cruel bill possible because they think if they get it to the Supreme Court that they can overturn? So we're in a dire situation right now. We may have waited too long, but I'm not a pessimist. I'm not a fatalist. I'm going to tell you one more story about who you and I are, about our spiritual DNA. Anybody heard of a woman named Abigail Adams? Do you know that she called herself a Unitarian before there was even a Unitarian church? When she Googled Unitarian, she couldn't find a congregation. But yet she still called herself a Unitarian. And you may recall that she had a husband who was a president, who, by the way, was a Unitarian, and she had a son who was a president. But when, this is before the Constitutional Convention in 1776, and the Declaration and all that good stuff, she said, hey, John, we need to have one of those talks, you know. And she said, hey, when you and all your buddies go up there to Philadelphia, and you're going to establish this new thing. And he said, why don't you make it a priority to have a government based on just and liberal principles that bring equality to men and women? And she wrote in a letter to her friend Mercy Warren, when I said that to John, he got a little saucy with me. I like that. Got a little saucy with me. And then I looked at him and I said, if you go up there and y'all make laws, I don't think shit y'all, but if you make laws in which we have neither a voice or representation, we will foment a rebellion. That's who we are. That's our spiritual DNA. So I'm going to say, let us be part of fomenting a rebellion. It ain't okay. We cannot sit here docile in our comfortable sanctuaries and be safe and be in harbor and not stand up and get up and say, no, it ain't